Ever since we reviewed the incredibly impressive Dan Clark Audio Stealth here at the store, everyone has been looking forward to an open-backed version of this headphone. And Dan Clark Audio has delivered with a new open-backed flagship called the Expanse. Let me get this out of the way first. If you liked the sound of the Stealth, but you are philosophically opposed to the idea of buying a closed-back headphone at this price point, then I think you'll be pretty happy with the Expanse. The Expanse is a Stealth which sounds slightly more open and slightly more mellow, but is otherwise not hugely different from the Stealth. Where it gets interesting to me is how the Expanse compares not with the Stealth, but with other high-end open-backed headphones, but we'll get into that later. First, let's talk about the Expanse's design. I'm going to speed run through this part because the Expanse shares the same basic design as the Stealth, except that it has an open-back grille and is slightly more breathable, and now the stitching on the headband is blue instead of red. You can watch our review of the Stealth if you want more details about this design, but basically, kudos to Dan Clark for once again making a relatively lightweight and super comfortable flagship headphone. One thing worth pointing out is that the Expanse seems slightly harder to drive than the Stealth, possibly because the mid-range is a tad less forward. I still think the Chord Mojo 2 will drive the Expanse just fine with modern studio recordings, but it may start to noticeably distort with some low-level live and classical recordings. To be safe, I would recommend pairing the Expanse with an amplifier that can produce at least 800 milliwatts at 32 ohms to cover a wide range of recordings. For reference, we've been testing the Expanse with the Chord TT2 and the Moon 430 HAD. With that in mind, let's dive right into the meat of the review, the sound. For the most part, the Expanse takes everything that is good about the Stealth and introduces some slight changes to the tuning, which makes it a little more rounded and laid back. The Expanse is tweaked slightly warmer than the Stealth, with richer mid-bass. Conversely, the upper mids, which can sound hot on the Stealth with some aggressive recordings, are a few decibels less forward in the mix on the Expanse. So whereas the Stealth conveys more of a sense of sparkle and breath in the vocals, the Expanse sounds more muted and subdued. You'll prefer one or the other based on your preferences, but to me, the slightly smoother upper mid-range makes the Expanse very, very pleasant to listen to. The Expanse is a bit more forgiving of bad recordings than the Stealth, and this makes the Expanse the better all-rounder, though it does sound slightly less exciting and less punchy when compared to the Stealth. The Expanse does preserve the same great technical performance of the Stealth, which is to say, the sound has incredibly snappy, transient response and fast attack up there with the very best. You'll notice that I haven't once mentioned soundstage yet, even though you might expect a big change here when compared to the Stealth, with this being an open-backed headphone and all. And here's the really surprising thing. The Expanse really does not sound much more open than the Stealth. Whereas the Stealth is a very open-sounding closed-back headphone, the Expanse is a closed-sounding open-backed headphone. Or to put it another way, when you listen to the Stealth, it feels like being in a very small, well-damped studio room. With the Expanse, it feels like you're in the same room, but someone has left the door open. Yes, if you listen hard, you will hear slightly less cut reflection from the Expanse when you compare it with the Stealth, especially in the mid-bass. But because the Expanse is tuned more mellow, the overall sound of the Expanse can still come off as thicker and slower than the Stealth. Now, if you compare the Expanse's tuning against other high-end open-backed headphones, like the Audeze LCD5 or the Abyss 1266, the Expanse sounds more forgiving with a safe, neutral tuning. The LCD5 sounds immediately clearer with more sparkle and an overall brighter tone, whereas the 1266 has a more exciting, aggressive tone with pronounced peaks in the highs and more pronounced bass. I think headphones like the Audeze and Abyss are more immediately engaging, but the Expanse is less fatiguing for multi-hour listening sessions across many genres. Where the Expanse suffers in comparison with these other open-back flagships is in soundstage. The Expanse is a soundstage which is noticeably smaller and more damped than the competition. The actual definition and imaging of the Expanse is hard to fault, but the scale of the instruments is smaller and more localized to the sides of your head, and you get much more of that small room feel. This is why I find this a confusing review, because really I think the Expanse is every bit as good as the Stealth, and if I was extremely happy with the Stealth, I should be very happy with the Expanse. And yet, while the Stealth is a stunning technical achievement as a closed-back headphone, I can't help but feel the Expanse has a lot of strong competition in the field of open-backed headphones. I think that if you value balanced tonality and definition more than soundstage, the Expanse is almost a perfect headphone. It delivers a brilliantly neutral tuning, amazing transient response, all in a terrifically comfortable design. But if you're looking for a truly expansive improvement in soundstage over the Stealth, then surprisingly enough, the Expanse may not deliver. In fact, if your environment is even slightly noisy, I would argue that the Stealth might still deliver a better experience just because the closed design delivers a lower noise floor that makes listening more immersive. Let me know what you think. Drop in and have a listen or order online at minidisc.com.au. This is Lachlan for Minidisc TV, and we'll see you next time.